Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on arseblog.com. How are you? Hope you're well. It's an Interlull Arsecast. Yeah, it is an Interlull. It really does feel like one, doesn't it? It's been a boring week. If only there was something interesting in the world of, I don't know, politics or something to keep us entertained or interested or flabbergasted or shocked and appalled. If only. Sadly, that's not the case, so we're just going to have to get on with it as best we can, because we could have just not done a podcast today. That would have been okay. You know, there's no Arsenal until not next weekend, but Monday. So the Interlull ends and everybody else gets to play next weekend, but no, we have to wait until Monday night at 8 o'clock before we get going again. That's against Newcastle. So, you know, it would have been okay, I think, to say, hey, this week, let's not do a podcast because there's so much nothing happening. However, such is our commitment to our fantastic, loyal listeners. That's you, by the way. And thank you very much, as always, for being here. We couldn't leave you with more nothing on a Friday when there's already so much nothing that everyone's going, I wish there was less nothing. So it's incumbent on us, I think, to provide you with something to listen to. We do that, and I'm going to be talking to the author of a very, very interesting book about the Premier League. I'll introduce him now in a couple of moments' time. Normally, this would be the time where we do a little bit of a roundup of the week's news, but there's been so little going on that there isn't. Let me just go back on the website, onto Arseblog News here, and see what are the big stories of the week. Denis Suarez, is he even real? Unai Emery settles into life in England by buying bird's eye potato waffles, and cloud in shape of Herbert Chapman trolls Tottenham's new stadium. That's what kind of a week it's been, folks. It's been one of those weeks. The chaps that aren't away on international duty have gone to Dubai for some warm weather training and a bit of a friendly game next week as well to keep the old legs moving ahead of the game against Newcastle, of course. So some of the guys gone include Mesut Ozil, Lauren Koscielny, Alex Lacazette, Mustafi, Petr Cech, and a load of young players have gone out too as well. So that'll be a nice experience for them. Also nice, they brought along Hector Bellerin, Rob Holding, and Danny Welbeck, three guys who have or who will be spending quite a lot of time alone and away from the rest of their teammates as they recover and recuperate from injuries. Danny Welbeck, I guess, is the closest to a comeback, but whether we're going to see him again in an Arsenal shirt, I don't know. Rob Holding and Hector are out until next season, of course, but they went along too, so that's nice. Get all the chaps together, and this thing is more about team building and team spirit and a bit of bonding than it is training. You know, they could just stay at London Colney and do the training if that's what they wanted. So it's about maybe getting everyone together and fostering a bit more of a team spirit and do all those fun things that you can do when you go to Dubai, like look at the tall building and go shopping. They've got lots of shopping there in Dubai. I was looking it up. There's loads of places. There's the Mall of the Emirates, the Dubai Mall, and if you do buy two, you get one free. When John Terry went in there, it was, of course, another prick in the mall. There's the French District, the Gaulle Mall. There's the shopping centre, which has no products whatsoever. It's called Mall or Nothing. The Looney Tunes Shopping Centre, that's mall, folks. And, of course, if you can't get out during the day because it's too hot, you can go to the Lionel Richie Emporium, which, of course, is open all night long. No, I am not sorry. I refuse to apologise. Absolutely not. I won't do it, I shan't do it, and I won't do it. Right. I will leave it there, though, I promise. Enough is enough. My guest on the show this week is the co-author of a fantastic book called The Club, How the Premier League Became the Richest, Most Disruptive Business in Sport. He has co-authored it with Jonathan Clegg, and today I'm delighted to welcome to the show Josh Robinson. Hi, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
So I think most people will know or realise or have experienced the change that happened in English football when the Premier League came into being. It was at a difficult time for English football because there was a lot of things going on, the Hillsborough disaster, facilities, and the way that the game was marketed, if it was even marketed at all. What we could view as TV watchers was very minimal. And the Premier League came along and changed all that. And one of the key men who was involved in that was somebody who's well known to Arsenal fans, and that's David Dein.
Yes. As you rightly say, English football in the late 80s was really at its lowest ebb. The facilities were not fit for purpose. It was badly marketed and underrepresented on television. I mean, the beginning of the 1985-86 season, there was actually no football on English television because of a dispute between the broadcasters and the clubs. And David Dein was one of the people who realized that this was an absolutely crazy state of affairs. And as you may know, Mrs. Dein is American, so David was spending a lot of time in the U.S. in those days. And that's where really he got the inspiration to think and began to realize, hang on a second, this is what professional sports can look like. He was watching the NFL and thought, it's this big entertainment business that we could replicate and also make money at. So, and you know, we take that for granted now, but that was really a novel concept in English football at the time.
Yeah, I mean, when you look back to some of the figures that were doing the rounds in terms of what clubs were making from television and what have you, they're absolutely minuscule compared to what they were now. And I think you make the point in the book that football clubs weren't viewed, or it was a new thing for football clubs to be viewed as businesses. They weren't run as businesses, they were run as institutions, and the people that were in charge of these clubs were often seen as custodians rather than people who were interested in making money. I mean, it just simply didn't really occur to people that football could be the kind of goldmine that it has become.
No, exactly. It was, you became a custodian of this institution, and your job as owner was really just to look after it for a long time. But just looking after something doesn't necessarily create the kind of incentives that turning profit does. So, you know, when you're talking about actually giving the fans something back for what they're paying for, you know, it meant an increase in ticket prices for sure, but it also meant that, hang on, we're going to create a match day experience. The fans don't owe us their support either. You know, we have to make it an enjoyable experience for them to come out here.
The quote from David Fryer, or Ken Fryer rather, is, you know, if you treat people like animals, they'll behave like animals. And facilities were a big thing for David Dein, and anyone who experienced football in the 80s will be well aware that facilities were rudimentary, to say the least, particularly during the years when terraces were how people watch football. Dein was, if not obsessed, he was certainly wedded to the idea that people should have good toilets.
Well, the toilets became kind of the symbol for everything else. And if you remember in those days what the toilets were, you might still be having nightmares about them, because they were not set up to, one, for hygiene, certainly not, or two, to move people through quickly and give them enough time to both use the toilet and then go get a cup of tea at halftime. David Dein became fixated on this and thought, if we can just create a more pleasant experience all around, we'll actually improve the behavior of fans at games as well. And this was something that was right at the front of everyone's mind in the 80s because of you know, a decade of hooliganism problems. Figuring out ways to improve behavior at games was something that the government was trying in very ham-fisted ways to control. But David Dein had this other solution, and the other directors at Arsenal, which involved sort of just making the experience better and more civil. And from there, if you're in a nicer, more upgraded environment, you're less likely to tear out the seats.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true. And I think that's borne out to be true. I mean, I think there are other reasons for things becoming a bit more friendly and family friendly and the hooliganism dying off. But when it came to creating the Premier League itself, there were rival parties. Everybody associates the Premier League with Sky and Sky Television and the advent of this kind of saturation broadcast that wasn't something we had experienced before, certainly this side of the Atlantic, where it wasn't just a game. There was a lot going on before the game. There was a lot going on after the game. Some of that was, nonsense. Over the years, that's been sort of weeded out. But, ideas like cheerleaders and halftime entertainment and all this kind of stuff were new things. But it was very close to not being on Sky at all. And what that might have meant for Rupert Murdoch's empire, we can only speculate. But, it was ITV and Sky who were broadcasting or bidding for the broadcasting rights. Sky came in right at the very end, but it also came after the people who were tasked with creating the Premier League found a loophole which allowed them to make it happen.
Exactly. This was a group of young bucks, the younger, in quotes, because they were in their 40s as opposed to sort of the old men who ran football clubs in those days, who saw the opportunity. And one of them was David Dein, obviously. The other was Martin Edwards at Man United, and the third was Irving Scholar from that other team from across North London, and and working with Rick Parry, who was the first chief executive of the Premier League and later went on to work at Liverpool. The four of them formed a quite close friendship and a really effective working partnership, whereby they were trying to figure out how they could, at this point, pull out from the traditional football league structure, which was the core problem. The way, because the football league negotiated collectively, the teams at the very top of the pyramid got paid exactly the same amount as the teams 94 places below in the various league tables when it came to TV rights. And this was a situation that no one else thought was completely crazy except for this small group of entrepreneurial owners. And so as they're casting around through legal documents and trying to figure out a way to do it, they also profited from a moment when the Football League was quite at odds with the FA for a variety of reasons. And so very quickly, when they found this loophole to break away from the Football League, managed to get the FA on side. And a big part of it was just adding the words, adding the letters FA Premier League. And that was a big part that satisfied the Premier League and thought, hang on, we're going to improve the England team through this mechanism as well. It may or may not have panned out. But they jumped on board very quickly, and that was the rubber stamp they needed. From there, it became an issue of then putting it on television, finding the right broadcast partner, and the big five as they were then, which was Arsenal, United, Spurs, Liverpool, and Everton, driving the breakaway, had all preferred ITV because they had a relationship with Greg Dyke, who you may remember from later on at the BBC and the FA.
Yeah.
And what happened there was Sky came in at the last minute, driven in part by Alan Sugar, who opposed the ITV deal because he had taken over from Scholar at Spurs and was actually selling the satellite dishes to Sky in those days, which is David Dein talks at length about trying to get Sugar barred from the vote, and that went on and on. But ultimately, Sugar gets to vote, and Sky had realized also just how important this was going to be. Murdoch understood that to build the Sky empire in Britain, which was losing about £1 million a week at that stage, he had to base it on two things, and it was going to be soap operas and football. And he went very, very big on football. The morning of the vote, as they're taking the bids from ITV and Sky, we have it in the book. He gets woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning in New York saying, we need another £30 million on the table. And he puts it up. And that morning, the course of English football changed forever.
Yeah, the ITV bid, which they were going to accept, was somewhere in the region of 260 million, and Sky came in with, is it 305 or something like that? Something similar.
Yeah, thereabouts, depending on sort of where you started.
Yeah, so it sort of sparked a new era in English football, obviously, but an era of professionalism as well. And one of the stories I think that I found fascinating in the book was that of Manchester United and Martin Edwards. And at the time, people were always critical of United because they had so much money and they had merchandise here, there, and everywhere. But they were basically the first club to realise the importance of those kind of revenue streams, and they left everybody behind. Now it seems so absolutely innocent, doesn't it, in comparison to where some of the money in the Premier League comes from? Basically, they created business based on the support and the brand and the following of Manchester United. They might have, put Manchester United's logo on every single thing they could put it on and sell it all around the world. Maybe some people found that distasteful at the time. It just feels very innocent now. But, this was a situation, this was a football club at that time that had given, was it Matt Busby and Matt Busby's family, a 25-year lease on the club shop and the merchandise. They had no merchandising deals. Anybody could use the logo or the crest, and you could just,
and the kit deal was negotiated by the manager.
Yeah, it's absurd. So they were the first really to realize that the revenue that you can generate from football isn't just going to come from what people pay over the turnstiles or via television income.
Absolutely. And Edwards understood that very early on. And the example of Busby and the club shop is a good one, because when he retired from the club, this is how much they valued the merchandising rights. They gave him a parting gift, which was a 20-year lease on the club shop. And Edwards realized that this was such a mistake in the 80s as he's trying to build up the merchandising side of the club, that 2 years before the lease expired, he said, no, we have to do this now, and goes and buys back the lease from Busby. And ultimately, that's what became the megastore outside of Old Trafford.
It's amazing that it gave them such an advantage as well during the 90s in the Premier League, where they had real financial firepower. But
they figured out a virtuous circle very early on, which was not just the merchandising, but Edwards also realized that they had to invest in the stadium very quickly. So, I mean, he took on vast personal debt, and the club took on a lot of debt as well in trying to build and modernize Old Trafford very quickly. First, the Stretford end, adding more hospitality, which was controversial because it did take seats away from season ticket holders, but it generated revenue that they were then able to spend on the playing squad. And because they had that first mover advantage, a lot of people took at least a decade to catch up. Yeah,
Arsenal obviously went the stadium route as well, but much later. And I suppose what's a story that might interest people in the book as well is at the time when Arsenal were deciding, probably around the planning stages for the Emirates Stadium, a man arrived in English football who would change everything in much the same way that Sky changed everything, and that's Roman Abramovich. And he brought Chelsea, and he ploughed all kinds of money into them, and it was a new thing for English football. I know we had the Jack Walker at Blackburn example where a man came in and spent big money on a team, but this is small fry. And also the difference is, of course, was that Jack Walker was a Blackburn fan and he wanted his team to win. Abramovich, whatever reasons you want to give for his involvement in Chelsea, and I'm not sure I want to go particularly down that road in this interview, but he wasn't a Chelsea fan. This was an investment that he was making for his own reasons, but it could have been very different.
Absolutely. In looking to place some money abroad, he and picking up a big visible asset in Britain, he'd been advised by his bankers that, well, one club you can't touch is Arsenal because it's not for sale, which in one story we have in the book drove David Dein absolutely nuts because he seemed to believe that he could have gotten everyone on board to sell, and who knows how different Arsenal's history would have been had Abramovich bought it. But the other club he looked at and even went to meet with was Spurs, and we tell the story in the book of Roman Abramovich being in the Mercedes going up the Tottenham High Road and looking around and saying to the guy in the car with him, this is worse than Omsk, which was this grim outpost in Russia where they had where Sibneft had a refinery. So he didn't end up buying Spurs either, and lands at Chelsea, where Chelsea was in dire financial straits in those days. They weren't quite at a point where they were going to turn off the lights, but almost. So he comes in, they Google him, find the Forbes listing for him, and basically, do the diligence that Chelsea did on Abramovich basically amounted to that. And then they signed a deal in under an hour.
It'd be very interesting, wouldn't it, to think what would have happened if Roman Abramovich had bought Arsenal? Because, again, much like in the way that Manchester United were derided for being this moneybags club, there was great opposition from fans at the idea of a billionaire coming in and just ploughing lots of money into a football club. You know, you've bought your success, you've got no history. All those things are obviously very applicable to Chelsea. But, you know, there's a sort of cognitive dissonance required, isn't there, when it comes to people who own football clubs these days. And during the years when Arsenal weren't successful and weren't winning titles and the ownership structure had started to change, the opposition to a character like Abramovich, to an oligarch, where his money came from became less and less important to people. And the desire to see your club win the Premier League or be competitive in the Champions League was the overriding factor for people. And we had that, you know, with Kroenke and with Usmanov, where initially the idea of an Usmanov character was anathema to many people. It became less and less so during the barren years when trophies weren't being won.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point, Andrew. And what I was going to say is that, you know, the years around the construction of Emirates are really fascinating to me because, as you know, when they start building Emirates, it's very much in that kind of build for the future model that United had kind of shown everyone the way on, and thinking that, you know, match day revenue is still going to be a huge part of how we're able to reinvest in the playing squad, and you know, this is what has to happen. But by the time Emirates opens, that idea of, well, maybe an oligarch will just come in and buy us as well, had gained kind of validity in the minds of a lot of Premier League fans. And the football world had kind of spun around again. And it was a very strange kind of realization as Emirates opens that you know, the universe that it was conceived in no longer existed.
It was very different because what had happened was other people had come along to see that, okay, Premier League clubs are there for the taking if we want them. I mean, I suppose what's a curious thing about all this is the fact that David Dein is the guy who brought Stan Kroenke to Arsenal. The way that he brought Stan Kroenke to Arsenal was probably not the most advisable, in that it got him turfed out of the club. And Kroenke was initially viewed as a hostile investor. From what I understand, that was not Kroenke's belief at the time. He thought that he was going to be, you know, introduced to the Arsenal board, and then all of a sudden the shit hit the fan and Dein is gone. Dein crops up again then with Alisher Usmanov, a rival consortium or what have you, or whatever you want to call it, to not just Kroenke but to the other shareholders at the time, and sort of created, in his, I suppose, desire to move Arsenal towards that kind of model of ownership, where I think there was probably a personal upside for David Dein, created a Cold War, a boardroom Cold War at Arsenal that went on until last year when Usmanov sold to Kroenke.
Yeah, and it all made for a very strange decade at Arsenal, between the austerity following the opening stadium and that kind of boardroom tension. It sort of meant that while other clubs like Chelsea were just continuing to plow ahead with plans to spend fortunes, and you know, City arrived on the scene during that period as well, following the Abu Dhabi takeover, and United under the Glazers, which weirdly turned out to be one of the more stable relationships in the Premier League. It means that all that continued to advance while Arsenal was still trying to figure itself out.
So, look, as the Premier League has continued on its financially upward trajectory, you know, every time there's a TV rights deal, the money gets bigger and bigger and the foreign rights get bigger and bigger. We kind of ask ourselves, is this something that can continue? You know, how long can it go on for? Is this an inflationary bubble? You know, and will the bubble burst at some point. And there's sort of a sense that, look, they've created the beast and now they have to keep feeding the beast. How much can they continue to shovel into the stomach of this entity before it has a negative impact, or before the negative impact of that is reflected in fans? And I've got a follow-up question that I'll ask you in a minute about how football is being consumed these days. But it does feel like there's only so far it can go in its current guise.
Right, exactly. And we're at an interesting point now where we're seeing the fundamental driver of the first quarter century of the Premier League was UK TV rights. And we're at a point now where those seem to have leveled off a bit. And we're seeing as well, the clubs understand that the big growth opportunities are abroad in places like the Far East and places like the United States, where the NBC deal is basically one of the Premier League's favorites. They signed for 6 years for $1 billion. So there's a very clear intention to service those markets as well, and that understanding that that's where the next potential money spike is going to come from, because it's not going to come from the UK. So there's that, but there's also this growing tension between, as we know, the Big Six in the Premier League and the rest of the league, as the Big Six starts to feel that, like in 1992, maybe they're not getting their due. It's the whole discussion around the foreign rights and how those are redistributed. They used to be redistributed evenly between the 20 Premier League clubs. They tweaked the formula somewhat, but it was really significant when they did that in 2017, because that was the first time in the history of the Premier League that they actually went back and tweaked what was called the Founder Members Agreement, which was the founding document in 1992. And that's what set out how all the revenue was distributed in the Premier League. Tweaking that meant that, well, it's not sacred anymore. We can change it again for a few years down the road. And there's no doubt in my mind that the Big Six will come back, having sort of agreed to a fragile peace 18 months ago. There's no doubt in my mind that they'll come back and say, we want to change it again. We need an even bigger share of this pie. And they have this weapon that they're not afraid to use, or this threat they're not afraid to use, which is always, well, we're going to break away. We're going to go join a super league. And the threat is extremely valuable to them.
Yes, of course. And there was, you report in the book about a meeting in New York. I think the Glazers were there. Ivan Gazidis was there representing Arsenal and representing ultimately KSE, who were the majority shareholders at the time. The idea that the Big Six should get paid more than everybody else was shot down because it has to get the agreement of, I think, of 14 clubs. It didn't get that. And you can understand why. It's sort of like turkeys voting for Christmas. If you're going to, if you're a Bournemouth or somebody, why would you vote for something like that? It's absolutely crazy. But, what it has appeared to do, Josh, is create an environment in which the good of the game, or the good of football itself, or the fans, is an absolute irrelevance. And I was very struck very early on in the book by a quote from Graham Taylor. And, one of the things that they talked about at the start when they were going to create the Premier League is this will be good for England, for the English football team, etc., etc. And Taylor said, people think there must be a lot of thinking in this Premier League. There is none, and I'm not totally convinced this is for the betterment of the England team. I think a lot of this is based on greed. And that's a very canny quote from Graham Taylor there, because I think that's absolutely the case. And we are now in a situation where it's not football that's the driver, it's money that's the driver. And money kind of creates this greedy, avaricious way of doing business that will ultimately only benefit a few.
Well, this is one thing that struck me in researching the book and speaking to the dozens of people that we spoke to, is in building this empire, in building this monster, which works in a very smooth way and is a very slick product. It's important to remember that this was not always a coordinated effort by a bunch of Steve Jobs of the football world. they were not necessarily visionaries in that Steve Jobs kind of sense. It was really, they were looking out for their own self-interest, and everybody at every turn is looking out for their self-interest. And because of that, the stars aligned in such a way that it became this hugely successful thing. But it was not it was not always the plan. This was not what they pictured, mainly because they couldn't picture it. They never thought that this kind of money would come their way. It's really incredible how the circumstances that created the modern Premier League kind of enriched everyone in that way. I don't think that David Dein and Scholar and Edwards in 1992 could have ever imagined a Roman Abramovich, let alone a Sheikh Mansour, coming into the Premier League and flooding it with the money they did, or that Sky would continue its investment for over 2 decades the way it did. And so, in the end, they were rewarded for looking out for themselves, and so there was no reason not to continue doing it.
Where do you think it goes from here? Because, the growth of the Premier League globally, not just in England or in Europe, but globally, is very much tied to television. Mm-hmm. And we're now in an era where television, I'm not saying it's not important, but it's certainly less important, and more, it's not how everybody wants to watch football or experience football, because, we all have on our persons probably, a device which we can stream football on. Not the best way to watch it, but we can do it that way if we want. People consume football differently as well. For example, we have a live blog on our website, which was designed for people who couldn't watch a game. So you could follow some text commentary. But for every one person that follows it because they can't see the game, there's somebody else following it because they want to read what I'm writing while they're watching the game, and they want to chat to people as well. And the idea that you have to sit down in a specific room in your house in front of the big screen and watch TV is becoming less and less rigid, I think. But we have an organization that is shackled to television right at this moment in time. So how do you see that going? They're putting people in jail for 17 years this week for running streaming websites. There are far worse crimes committed every day of the week, and far lesser sentences given out, which perhaps speaks to the influence that the people with this kind of money have over the judicial system. But that's another argument. But, where is it going to go? And are they going to be adaptive to what people want, or are they going to keep making them do it the way they've always done it because those people can pay the most money?
I mean, this is the $1 million question, or maybe the $1 or $10 billion question. We forget that in 1992 the Premier League was actually, by siding with Sky, was actually the technological forefront. They bought into satellite TV very early. But of course, that was the model you described, which is you go into a special room in your house and you sit there for 2 hours and consume whatever's being kind of projected at you. Now figuring out what the next step is and what the new consumption habits are going to be for a product that still requires you to sit there and watch for 90 minutes is very tricky. The Premier League is dabbling in sort of OTT platforms and things like that, and we saw the Amazon deal that comes into effect next year. We'll see how that turns out. I mean, in France, for instance, where the Premier League is entirely on or the rights were bought by a totally digital platform, you have the option of watching every game as you would in England, but on your phone, which I guess you can do in England as well. But that is the primary focus, and then you cast it to your TV or whatever. But there are places that are experimenting with this, and how that goes is, as you say rightly, really going to determine the value of Premier League TV rights going forward. But it's
all that to say is I don't really know what the future holds in that respect. I mean, we see La Liga really experimenting with some new formats. I mean, their rights in India, for instance, mean that the games are broadcast on Facebook. Is that something we could see in the Premier League a cycle or two from now? I wouldn't rule anything out at this point, because people like Facebook and Amazon and Google are the ones who can afford to pay what Premier League rights cost now.
Yeah, and also have the platforms, to distribute the content.
And the reach. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, they have the reach. I mean, I suppose another thing that strikes me is that the success and the popularity of the Premier League, which I think has, in some ways driven not the interest in football, but sort of the football experience in general, because it's such a big league and it's so global. The offshoot of that is that sort of like a rising tide lifts all boats in a way. La Liga, the interest in La Liga, I think is quite interesting that, when it went off Sky, the amount of people watching La Liga plummeted simply because, the interest wasn't there. But we do have a football world in which there's international tournaments. They're being revamped. We're going to get a 48 Club World Cup. It's going to be played in the winter. We've got things going on all summer. Pre-season is no longer pre-season. Pre-season is now dressed up as this slightly competitive environment with the International Champions Cup and all those kind of things, that the appetite for football seems as insatiable as ever from the consumer point of view.
Yes, although I have to admit, I mean, occasionally and maybe you feel this way too, occasionally I do feel like there is too much football.
Yes, I do, but the people who make money don't.
Right,
I guess.
Right, as someone who covers it professionally, I find it exhausting. But it's the question now of figuring out, at what point are we getting away from kind of what makes it special and what makes it authentic? And, the global appeal of the Premier League is rooted in that, in that idea of the narrow streets leading up to the stadium and the songs. And we see it with foreign fans who show up at Emirates every weekend, and they're there to soak in that whole experience. But from the club's perspective, that's great, and they like those people. But what they also are caught in now is this question of who are we servicing? Is it the 60,000 fans who come to Emirates every weekend, or is it the potential audience of billions watching around the world? Who are we there for? And so that's left them in a tricky decision-making spot where those are the two things pulling them in opposite directions every time they have to decide how are we going to broadcast this, what content are we putting out there, who are our sponsors, all of those things that factor into keeping the club running. And then after that, you've also got the idea, I think, as people who are close to the Premier League and who've spent a long time watching it, the idea of blowing up the format of the club competitions seems anathema to everything we've ever known. But I'm always shocked, and I know you want to come to this, about when we talk about revamping the Champions League or the idea of a Super League, I'm always shocked at how many people around the world say this would be great. There are a lot of people out there who do want to see, Juve play Man City every week, and who would tune in happily to just watch that. They don't necessarily need Arsenal Huddersfield.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, we can go on and on about the potential downsides of a European Super League, and there are many. I think the impact on domestic leagues first and foremost, and fans who go to games right up there too. But it's been touted as a thing for such a long time. You wrote a story this week in the Wall Street Journal about meetings between the top clubs in Europe and a revamp of the Champions League, and potentially what it might mean for those games, but also how it might move us closer to that idea of a European Super League.
Right. And, the idea of a Super League scares
basically two stakeholders in football. One is the domestic leagues. So the Premier League, La Liga, Javier Tebas at La Liga has been extremely vocal about calling any potential Super League or even revamp of the Champions League a catastrophe waiting to happen. But it also scares UEFA because UEFA only has those competitions as its lifeblood. So it doesn't want another parallel organization. What it wants is to kind of harness whatever it is the clubs want and funnel it into its existing structures. And so you've got UEFA, which met with the clubs, the European Clubs Association on Tuesday, and this was what the story was about, which is finally they've decided, all right, we're in agreement, the competitions stay the same till 2024. After that, all bets are off. And if that means radically changing the Champions League to suit what the clubs want more, then it seems that UEFA is prepared to meet them at least halfway.
What kind
do the
of
clubs want?
Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask.
They want guarantees. They don't want to go through. They don't want to have the possibility of having a down season and then missing out on Champions League income. And we've seen it with Arsenal. We've seen it with Chelsea. We've seen it with Man United. It does affect your bottom line if you're out of the Champions League for a season or two. So what they want is, we want to sort of stay in regardless of domestic performance. And if that means a possible, say, you take the top 32 teams in Europe and then you only relegate 4 of them or 8 of them at the end of every Champions League, then that would suit them just fine, because it means that they could finish 7th at home but still be in the Champions League or whatever it may be called after 2024. And count on that income.
What is to stop, if anything, a modern David Dein, a modern Martin Edwards, a modern Irving Scholar coming together and putting together something new in the way that the Premier League was formed, but on a European level? I mean, now more than ever, there appears to be the money to make anything happen. And even if you're caught out using your money in the way you shouldn't be, the punishments are so minor and irrelevant, it's worth taking that risk. And then if you take those people out of the equation and you can just do what you want with your massive sums of money from the country or nation that owns your football club, it makes life an awful lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's give that potential investor a name. Agnelli, say. At Juve, he's been extremely vocal about wanting to remake the Champions League for years now. And he, in his heart of hearts, he doesn't even want to wait till 2024. He'd be pushing for 2021 if he could. And I think what we're seeing from the likes of Agnelli and leaders of other major clubs in leagues that aren't the Premier League is a fear that they've kind of hit their caps at home, that there is no more money out there, or at least in the big rich markets, to be spent on Serie A or on La Liga. So, and the Premier League draws so much oxygen that they can't keep up. So what do they have to do? They have to harness some of that excitement around the Premier League and bring it to them. And if that means remaking a competition where they're just with each other all the time and not wasting their time as they see it with, Udinese or, Villarreal, then so be it. If they're just playing Premier League teams and each other every week, then that's what's going to make the most money for them, and that's what they want. It really is a whole different mindset.
Yeah, it sure is. And look, it's fascinating and scary and weird and slightly discombobulating to think where football might be in 5 or 10 years' time. Things that I had never thought possible are happening. The Qatar World Cup, for example, having a World Cup in the winter, in the middle of the season, just was absolutely unthinkable. Having every club in the world in the fucking World Cup is what seems to be going to happen next as well. So
it's happening, and it seems to be happening faster and faster.
Yeah, and even stuff like the game 39 that was proposed from the Premier League point of view, play a round of games abroad. La Liga, I think it's fascinating to hear you say La Liga are absolutely opposed to the idea of a European Super League because they clearly want and need Barcelona and Real Madrid to be playing in La Liga, and yet they're trying to play games abroad. So it's sort of like the thirst for money is robbing people of common sense.
Of course, and in La Liga's case, it's they're kind of scrambled by looking at the Premier League and trying to figure out ways to catch up. And so and the Game 39 thing, that idea is not dead. They kind of put it on the back burner for years, but Scudamore was still very much in favor of it when he left Premier League. And we spoke to a guy like Ferran Soriano at Man City for the book, and he says openly, this is a great idea. He would do it if he could, because the people running football clubs today genuinely don't see anything wrong with it. And it's what I said before about who are they servicing. Yeah, it might upset the season ticket holders at home, but there's an audience of potentially billions out there who would absolutely love the chance to go see City play Arsenal in LA in a game that mattered.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, a game that mattered, and not the International Champions Cup.
Right.
Josh, it's a fascinating book. You've co-authored it with Jonathan Clegg. It's called The Club, How the Premier League Became the Richest, Most Disruptive Business in Sport. It really is well worth a read, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed to Josh. You can follow Josh on Twitter if you like, at Josh Robinson23, at Josh Robinson23. And the book is a really great read. Lots of stuff you will know, but there's so many little stories and additional details and snippets of stuff. It makes for fascinating reading. You can find more details about the book, and you can order it online from theclubbook.com. That is theclubbook.com, or you can get it from your local independent bookstore. If they don't have it, I am sure if you ask the nice man or woman behind the counter, they will be delighted to order it in for you. We need bookstores, we need bookshops. I know it's really, really handy just to sort of click a few buttons and have it delivered in a day or two, but get some exercise, go to the bookshop, support a local business, and you get a fantastic book into the process. Right, I'm going to leave it there because there isn't an awful lot going on this weekend. No Arsenal anyway. James and I will be here on Monday. We will have an Arsecast Extra for you. If you feel like you'd like some more things to listen to and you're not already an Arseblog member on Patreon, sign up right now and you can listen to the first in a brand new series of podcasts called The Players. Myself, James, Andrew Allen, Tim Stillman, we discuss the Arsenal career and life of Dennis Bergkamp, and there will be many more players to come. There's loads more podcasts in there, history podcasts, live streams, loads of stuff and articles. You also get a free copy of our audio book, Together, the Story of Arsenal's Unbeaten Season, and all it costs you is a €5 a month, €5 a month. And if you're in the EU, you pay a bit of VAT. If you're not in the EU, you don't have to pay VAT. So if you're outside the EU, no VAT. It costs just a €5 a month, and you get instant access to all of that content and everything else that we will be posting in the future. So do check that out. And of course, it does help support everything that we do here on the site, all the podcasts and articles and blog and news and everything else. So if you fancy a bit of that, come on board. You can be an Arseblog member on Patreon right away. It's patreon.com/Arseblog. Patreon.com/Arseblog. Catch you on Monday for the Arsecast Extra. Until then, cheers. Bye-bye. Sorry about this, folks, but we've been contacted by the advertising standards people who say that in order not to show preferential treatment to any particular shopping centre in Dubai, we're going to have to mention every single one of them. So the one you go to when you're on your own, of course, is Mall by Myself. And when you're with your friends, it's Mall Together Now. If you're into the solo work of a female singer who was in an 80s synth duo, then you go to Mole Cried Out. They do have a fantastic selection of vinyl in there. 12 inches, 10 inches, 7 inches, picture discs. They even have some stuff on mini disc as well. If you've just been broken up with, well, you're mole out of love. And if your hands are cold, well, there's only one place to go, of course. All you need is gloves. You may now unsubscribe from this podcast without any guilt. Cast without any guilt. Cast without